Welcome back. Hope you're enjoying the afternoon. I certainly am. We're going to move into the part of the agenda now where we're going to have a perspective from our sociologist talking about migration and the impact of the manufacturing industry on migration in this area and in our state. I'm going to introduce Dr. Louise Jeziersky to you. Dr. Jeziersky is with the James Madison College here at MSU. It is also a residential college, I believe, where the students live and learn in the same area, the same facility. So I'll just get on with it and turn it over to Dr. Jeziersky, and we're so happy to have you here.
Thanks again. Good afternoon, and I'm so sorry that you're missing this beautiful afternoon outside. It's, but hopefully you'll learn a little bit more about our backyard. Thanks to Doreen, and I'm happy to answer any questions about James Madison College if you have any. I know that we've always welcomed and been happy, really lucky to have Lansing students join the college, and I'm a huge advocate of it. I've been at Madison for 15 years. It's an interdisciplinary college of social science, but it also includes a large humanities component with a year of writing and fusion of culture. Well, thank you. And as a social scientist who does interdisciplinary work, obviously with sociology, which is my PhD, but also in history and geography and increasingly humanities. I mean, all of us need to incorporate humanities into our work, and I'm sure as a teacher, we have that in common, trying to think about how to bring history to life in a way, in new kinds of ways. And so the NEH project of Picturing America seemed a perfectly great fit for me, because I and my colleagues all are working to create a sense of how humanities can be built into social sciences all the time, including film, music, TV shows, how to read those as texts, especially think about how to cite them as texts. That's the big trouble that my students have. They don't know how to cite a movie as a text. And I just think it's just an important and very enriching piece of cultural capital for our students. They need to be introduced to these things. So I actually was going to end up with a video, and I'll just sort of give the ending first. I have a video that I cannot show you because it's old technology. The last iteration of this talk, I actually did get to show this video, and I'll spend a little bit more time talking about it, but we're actually thinking about how to convert this into streaming so you all can have access to that. It's this conversion to that. So I'll leave that for last, but this is going to be my finale, no finale. So let me start with just this idea of trying to get students to think back in time that Detroit was the Silicon Valley of the United States at the turn of the century. It was the mightiest industrial center of the world. And the technology, not just in terms of the moving assembly line, but the organizational form, the idea of vertical integration in economics and production, the social requirements of bringing multiple kinds of people from all around the world to come work in the factories for Ford was a huge management problem, as Henry Ford came to see, but it was also a grand experiment in democracy. And it's that romantic piece of this democratic economic powerhouse that makes me love Detroit and makes me want to continue to teach Detroit as this really important watershed in modernization and what's the next chapter for Detroit. Here's a picture by Charles Sheeler of the River Rouge plant. I teach a course on Detroit almost every year. I've been teaching it almost for 20 years now. I end up taking students on a tour of Detroit, sort of a one-day tour. My dean at James Madison College has always been very generous in providing a bus. We spend the day, and always, always, always the River Rouge plant is on that tour, in part because it is the iconic structure, both social, economic, but physical plant that typifies what Detroit was able to accomplish, in this case, the Ford Motor Company. Charles Sheeler also has an iconic view of the River Rouge in photographs. And the DIA, the Detroit Institute of Art, has shown a bunch of industrial photography, historical photography of River Rouge, including this. But this is a painting, and it was done in 1930, and it makes it look almost like a pastoral landscape. You can see the reflection of the factory in the River Rouge. It's sort of it's sort of benign white smoke instead of being this huge industrial behemoth, which is ironic in this day and age, knowing what's gone on. But as we lose these landscapes, I think there's also another understanding of how to romanticize these structures and what's going on. The Rouge plant was built in 1927. Obviously, Henry Ford built his first plant in the city of Detroit. But he had his own land in Dearborn, it's not in the city of Detroit, and had planned this large structure to incorporate the vertical integration that was required to do not just car manufacturing, but everything manufacturing. So Ford owned lumber up in Minnesota. That lumber came down through the Great Lakes to be an important piece of the structural components here. He brought in glass and sand for glass making. He made paint here. So as the limestone and the iron ore and the steel, and it was created, it was all brought in for the steel making. All the raw materials came into the River Rouge, and it came out a Model A. The Model T was built in Highland Park, and in Detroit, but the Model A was built here. And when it was at its height, before the crash of the Great Depression, it employed 100,000 people. And that would support, if you think about a family of four, about 500,000 people. So when you think about Detroit being almost 2 million people, it's because these plants were so gigantic and employed people from all over the world. And Ford, this was already a global enterprise. He already was bringing in rubber from rubber plantations in Brazil. I was recently in Brazil for a study abroad piece in Salvador, and there's a fantastic new book out called Fordlandia that talks about the story of how Henry Ford bought up rubber tree plantations in Brazil and created this raw material that then was sent to River Rouge. But also he started manufacturing cars in Brazil, and in Brazil, Ford just celebrated its 100th anniversary of car production. Brazil did. So you really need to think about this as a global enterprise from the get-go. And you can still go to see the River Rouge. I tell my students for two reasons. One is that it is a very great historical asset where they've created sort of a parkway. You can drive through Miller Road. You can stop and read about the history of the plant. The most important product that came out of the Ford River Rouge plant was the Ford Mustang, and they have pictures of all the different cars that were made there. Now it's the home of the F-150. And when the Detroit Visitors Bureau were asking people, what would you like to see in Detroit? And Hitsville, Motown was one of the top things. But visitors wanted to see an auto assembly plant. People don't often get to see the insides of these kinds of places much anymore. And so when the Ford Motor Company decided to upgrade the River Rouge plant for the F-150, they built this beautiful new green plant. And you can take a tour of it through the Henry Ford Museum. And you go to the Henry Ford Museum, they'll put you on a bus, they'll take you to River Rouge, and you can do a tour of the plant. They actually have a great overhanging walkway, so you can walk the entire floor of the plant. There's computers there that you can do interactive work with on the computers. It's best to go when the plant's in production. It's way more interesting to see workers on the shop floor than to go when the plant is not peopled with real workers. But you can still go to see it, and And so I encourage you to do that, and maybe if there is ever money, I can't afford to take my students either, but it's a cool thing to do. So when you think about the kinds of pull factors that were bringing people from all over the world to the River Rouge plant, obviously Detroit and all of Michigan was changing. And why did the Ford plant, why did all these auto plants show up here in the first place? So the role of migration is intimately connected to the place like the Rouge plant. For example, obviously Ford was intent on recruiting workers. They brought Yemeni workers to work in the plant paint shop. The paint shop was actually a very dangerous place to be. It's very toxic. But Yemeni workers came in the 20s, and we had our first mosque in the city of Detroit as early as 1928. They brought in Poles, obviously, to work in steel and ironwork. But the other thing is we had skilled workers here in Detroit, in the Detroit area, early on. Obviously, working in carriage work. We were sort of the gateway to the West. We had a lot of lumber. We could make carriages, and the carriage was the key structure for the car. But we also had paint manufacturing. We had other kinds of chemical manufacturing, and we had stove manufacturing. And the stove manufacturing was really key for the auto industry. So Olivier Zuns did a great book, a historical book called The Changing Face of Inequality, where he looks at the early 20th century Detroit. And he says it was a total industrial landscape. I just like the phraseology of this. It was a total industrial landscape. There was stove making, brewing, furniture making, chemical aircraft part manufacturers, oil refineries, salt mines, steel mills, garment manufacturing, food processing plants, largest pharmaceutical manufacturer in the world, adding machines, and typewriters. And each of these skill sets required workers that were skilled workers. The moving auto assembly line, of course, incorporated low-skill work. And in fact, the key technological change that was required is that you had skilled manufacturing making carriage work. But what Henry Ford did was break down that craft work into little tiny pieces. In some phraseology, de-skilling workers, and then taking control of that production process, taking all the knowledge that workers had in their brains and putting on this moving assembly line. And of course, Ford was also infamous for hiring workers who couldn't speak with each other on the line. He would put people who spoke different languages next to each other in line so they couldn't converse because they were concerned about labor unrest. Here's a picture of the Changing Face of Inequality book, and covers this Detroit history from 1880 to 1920 to help you understand the foundations of this key skill set. I'm not sure if you can see this, if it's big enough for you, but and it's probably too small on the handout. But you can see that as early as 1900, obviously native white Americans were important, but they were really only 1/5 of the population in 1900. There were native black Americans. Our history with the Underground Railroad had brought native black Americans up through the late 19th century. Canadians were important here, but there's also already 13% of native born with mixed foreign parentage, so it was already capturing a lot of that immigrant migrant population, especially Germans and Irish. If you go to Michigan Avenue and you go where the old Tiger Stadium site used to be, that neighborhood's called Corktown. It's called Corktown because it was the Irish neighborhood. Canadians were also everywhere, and Germans were probably the most important, the largest other migrant group. 10% in 1900 were Germans, and another 13% were German Americans. Poles about 4%, Russians and Italians were small. I don't understand why the Italians didn't come to Detroit like they did to other places in the United States. Could use more good Italian food, I think, in the state. And we could use more Italians. One of my favorite painters is Jacob Lawrence. And the DIA is lucky enough to have some of Jacob Lawrence's work, but he did an entire series called the Migration Series. And let's see if I didn't think about opening this up, But this is the most iconic of all his paintings to depict this great migration from the South. And you can see streams of people at a train station going to Chicago, New York, and St. Louis. But they also went to Pittsburgh, to Cleveland, to Detroit from the South. And there were two important components that brought African Americans here. One was a push factor, the other was a pull factor. The pull factor we've already talked about. There were jobs here, and Henry Ford and other manufacturers went down and recruited African Americans and gave them one-way tickets at the train station to come up and take jobs in the North. But the push factors are also really important. If you think about the role of Detroit as being a total industrial landscape, that was also making its way to the South as well. And in this period of sharecropping, highly labor intensive, Southern agriculture was also being industrialized. Once you have the cotton gin invented, you don't need as many manual laborers. And so people were being displaced by technology in the South as well. So the push factor is just really displacing lots and lots of agricultural workers. In the 1930s, a third of all Americans were working in agriculture. A third, and that has dropped down to 2% by the 1960s. And so one of the key components of this is this push factor of displacing agricultural workers, manual workers, and bringing them to the North. And Jacob Lawrence captures this so beautifully. Oops, I went the wrong way, sorry. And there's a beautiful poem by Langston Hughes. He writes about the one-way tickets. Let me play this for you.
This poem is called One-Way Ticket. I pick up my life and take it with me, and I put it down in Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo, Scranton, Harlem, any place that is north and east and not Dixie. I pick up my life and take it on the train to Los Angeles, Bakersfield, Seattle, Oakland, Salt Lake, any place that is north and west and not south. I am fed up with Jim Crow laws, people who are cruel and afraid, who lynch and run, who are scared of me and me of them. I pick up my life and take it away on a one-way ticket, gone up north, gone out west, gone.
Beautiful. So let me close that and get back into my PowerPoint. So he captures this freedom that relieves people from this hard labor, the Jim Crow, to the relative freedom of the North. And this is another important painting that's in the series in the Picturing America list. Another panel by Jacob Lawrence, the migration panel. This is number 57. He says, I always wanted to be an artist, but I assumed I would work in a laundry. Well, people were coming up north with it. They didn't know what kinds of skills there would be and what kinds of jobs there would be, the kinds of skills that they could use to translate into this new life up north. And a lot of African American women did do this kind of work, laundry work. They worked in domestic work. And this is a picture that shows sort of alternative future for them. They didn't necessarily have jobs in the plants, as we'll see in a couple slides down the way. Ford Company did hire African American men, but they were the only ones that did. GM did not, and neither did Chrysler. And it was important to have the security of that kind of job. Coleman Young, who was mayor of Detroit, got his first crack at a real adult life by working at Ford's, as they used to say, at Ford's. And it was you wore a Ford button and you were proud, and men who had those kinds of jobs said they were all the rage with the girls because they knew they were a good catch because they had a solid job at Ford or Ford's. So when I took my students to the Detroit tour this past March, we go to the River Rouge, we look at the plant, we look at the history of the labor history that's depicted there as well, the Battle of the Overpass that takes place there, and then we end up at the DIA. And if you're lucky enough to take your students to the DIA, they do have great group rates there. This depicts the inside of the River Rouge, and this is the south wall of the mural by Diego Rivera, and this was commissioned by the Ford family, Edsel Ford, Henry's son, was the mastermind behind getting Diego Rivera to do this. There's whole books written on these murals. When my students went, we spent an hour with the docent talking about these murals and everything else in that room. It's an incredible asset to have here in Detroit. And it's completely rich. Diego Rivera was a communist, married to Frida Kahlo. He captures the labor troubles explicitly in these murals. It just shows you the total industrial landscape that these workers had to work in 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. I mean, their lives were total industrial landscapes, interior landscapes as well as exterior landscapes. And really the whole idea of the machine taking over your life and being part of that assembly line. I think that's the key piece of that history. There has been a lot of interesting theorization about this early modernization. One term that's been incorporated in social science from the last 25 years is the idea of Fordism, named for Henry Ford, and this total industrial landscape, interior and exterior, and its role in cities. The term was coined by Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian communist. He lived between 1891 and 1937. He was the Italian Communist Party secretary. He was imprisoned by Mussolini at the start of fascism in Italy. And when he was in prison, he had nothing to do but write little theoretical notes on little pieces of paper, and then he would spirit them out, and people compiled them for him. And there's a big book called the Prison Notebooks, where he does this analysis of the important role of new modern capitalism, and in some ways why Marx was wrong, and the importance of this new Fordist version of capitalism on everyday life. And so this idea of Fordism captures this new technological formation of capitalism, not the 19th century competitive capitalism that Karl Marx had written about, but this new modern capitalism, the total industrial landscape piece of it that incorporates workers not just as parts of machinery, but parts of an entire structure of capitalism. What Gramsci noted that Henry Ford was really accomplished here was creating a capitalism for the ages, in that workers weren't necessarily alienated only. They became part of the capital system because Fordism has three parts. One is mass production, and we already have seen visions of this. But the second most important thing is mass consumption, and Henry Ford invented this. Workers were paid so little that they couldn't afford what they were making. But Henry Ford bumped up the wage rate to double what the prevailing wage rate was, to $5 a day. And when they could make $5 a day, he solved two problems. One is that workers came, and they came from all over the world to work in these factories, and the work was so horrible, so onerous, that they left. And he couldn't keep workers on that line. But when he paid them $5 a day, that was enough incentive for them to sell their labor all day. But the second thing is it made them consumers. They actually could afford for the very first time to buy the Model A or the Model T that they were making. And so this idea of mass consumption being married to mass production, in some ways, according to Gramsci, was invented. The third piece of it is the welfare state, that you create a system that helps to support capitalism when it has crises. And so when the Great Depression came along and you had the welfare state invented under FDR, this helped to save capitalism. And even today, as we're talking about in my own classes and probably in yours, I have students, as you have students, who have lost jobs. Their parents have lost jobs. And the debates about how to bring the economy back. Well, one of the components of bringing the economy back, according to Keynesianism, is to increase consumption. If we're not all consumers out there, we can't bring the economy back. There's no demand. So this goes back to this early theory about the role of consumption in creating demand. But you can see Fordism is this massive physical presence, but also everyday life presence. So here's mass production depicted. Detroit's booming defense and automobile industries made the city a blue-collar mecca, magnet to tens of thousands of migrants who found relatively secure, well-paying jobs. At shift change, shown here, workers rushed out of their plants, heading to their homes in Detroit's innumerable working-class neighborhoods. So this is shift change. You can see cars in the parking lot. Others could live in working class villages near their factories. This is the component, the second component. This is the mass consumption part of it. This is Detroit's West Side, home to tens of thousands of blue-collar workers whose single-family detached homes made Detroit a low-rise city. So you can see mass production, mass consumption. The importance of the mass consumption really made America boom, and especially after World War II. First, we have the Great Depression. Nobody can afford anything because nobody's working. We come back in part because of the arsenal of democracy, the expansion of the factory system to gear up for the war effort, and then we're in the war. And after the end of the war, nobody has plants still standing. We have plants still standing. We convert these plants to re-gearing towards the consumption market, also transforming those arsenal democracy plants back to consumptive endeavors. And we build mass-produced housing, especially the Levitt towns, where you could bang out a house in a day. You essentially used to have craft work making houses, and in this case, you could have a crew deconstructing the building of a house. So you had, people who just put up the frame, those who were just roofers, and you applied the assembly line process to house building for the first time in the 1950s. And you have an assembly line house building piece that can build a suburb in a matter of months, from a potato field to a whole suburb. And they would bang out these houses explicitly. Not only did you have all these houses, building these houses, second of all, you had to fill those houses. So you filled those houses with washing machines and refrigerators and blenders and toasters. And all of these things were made in the United States. And you needed furniture, and Michigan was one important place for furniture manufacturing, especially in Grand Rapids. So furniture business was important in this massive consumption piece. You also had social policy, and this is where the welfare state piece comes in. We decided we needed to enhance the accessibility of home ownership, and so we created mortgage interest deductions that allowed any working class Joe or Jane to go buy a house on credit. Before World War II, you had to have about 50% down to buy a house. We might be getting there again, but nobody could afford a house. But until you could borrow money, until there was an FDIC that could protect savings, until you could actually have a deduction that you could deduct your home mortgage interest, that welfare state also made this consumption expansion possible. So you needed to have new regulatory components that would allow for new mortgage banking rules and buying on credit. And so not only did everybody need a car, they needed 2 cars. Because one needed, if you're going to build to 8 Mile, how are you going to get down to those factories down in the center part of the city? Not every household in the 20s had a car. You could actually go see old neighborhoods where they didn't have driveways. But then once you had the expansion, everybody had a driveway, and you had to have room for 2 cars. And it's very interesting to note in the census that we have now more cars per household than people. Because you might have one person in a household with 2 different cars. You might need a truck and a car. Or you might have a teenage kid in your household, and you might need 3 cars, 4 cars. So we now have more cars per household than people, which is an interesting development. So there are new urban forms that develop with Fordism. So you have the central business district that was once accessible by streetcar. The streetcar is replaced with buses and freeways, or this urban beltway. There's an interstate highway system that's also subsidized by the federal government. In 1956, the Federal Highway Act is supported as a National Defense Highway Act. Eisenhower saw the Autobahn in Germany. He said, we need that too. He actually had been on a crew early in his Army career where he had to do a convoy across the United States, and he couldn't get across the United States. There's really great films of him, the Army getting stuck in mud. So we really needed a federal program to create a federal highway system, and then the interstate system. So the interstate system subsidizes, through tax money, the expansion of suburbia, the expansion of car manufacturing, and we have an entirely new kind of landscape, a suburban or post-Fordist landscape that emerges, including service industries that move out to the outskirts, new towns that develop on the outsides of the city, but most especially for Detroit, the building of plants outside the city of Detroit. And in fact, there was not one new auto plant built in the city of Detroit after 1920 until 1979, when Coleman Young convinced Chrysler to build the Jefferson Avenue plant. So plants were moving outside the city and also bringing jobs to the outskirts. One more look at the Diego Rivera murals, and in this case, you can really see how workers are actually part of that machinery. And the far piece of it, you can see the steel mill, blast furnaces there. African Americans, like I said, did work at Ford. They worked in the blast furnaces, the most dangerous jobs in the plant. So the arsenal of democracy was really crucial for thinking about restructuring America from this place where, yeah, we had lots of manufacturing, but at this point, really, after the Great Depression, after the sacrifices of World War II, transforming America into a mass consumption, mass society. So Tom Segru, my favorite author, who has written the most important book probably in urban history in the last 20 years. This won the 1998 Bancroft Prize, which is the #1 best history book in the United States prize. He's from Detroit. He teaches history at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And he writes this book called The Origins of the Urban Crisis, Race and Inequality in Post-War Detroit. And he begins with the Arsenal of Democracy in 1943, and he ends in 1967. And the purpose of this book is to argue that the crisis of Detroit begins when the Arsenal of Democracy ends, right after World War II. And that the riots of Detroit did not cause the downfall of Detroit. The downfall of Detroit caused the riots of 1967. The 67 riots were a reaction to the decline of Detroit as the Arsenal of Democracy. So let's take a look at how he imagines this. Mid-20th century Detroit embodied the melding of human labor and technology that together had made the United States the apotheosis of world capitalism. The scene was a drama of might and violence, of human ingenuity and sheer physical labor, punctuated by the noise of pounding machinery, the sight of hundreds of workers moving rhythmically to the pulse of the line, the quiet but never unnoticed hovering of human arms and backs, the seemingly endless rush of workers through the gates at shift change time. Detroit's brooding horizon of factories and its masses of industrial laborers became icons of modernity. Well, obviously, this is an historian who deserves a prize. As a social scientist, we read so much bad nonfiction. It's so boring. We become bad writers ourselves. And for our own students to think about how to learn history, but not through boring history, you need to have great writing. And I always am trying to tell my students, don't read bad social science. Read, listen to Langston Hughes' poetry, look at pictures. What we want to do is show, not tell. And so here's a humanities lesson in itself, just reading this little paragraph about he captures the sound and the noise of the and the back-breaking labor that was required. And so when he writes this, the human ingenuity and sheer physical labor punctuated by the noise of pounding machinery, the sight of hundreds of workers moving rhythmically to the pulse of the line, he's putting words to this. Really, you can just illustrate both of these in such important ways through pictures and word pictures. I had a great time doing some research for this PowerPoint because it took me to the Michigan Historical Library. And there's really cool historical books that were published at the time celebrating the Arsenal of Democracy in Michigan. And this is one by Chrysler. This is a color plate that comes out of a book that was published, I think, in 1943 by Chrysler, illustrating what the Arsenal of Democracy in Michigan looks like. Yes, there's autos, but there's propellers, with Willow Run, the importance of aircraft production in Michigan as well. Just to see. I think this kind of art is lost, unless you're watching Mad Men or something like that. This historical art is crucial to bring back the sense and the power of the time. So Chrysler Corporation did a history called Mobilized by Wesley Stout in 1949, just looking back at its own role in the arsenal of democracy and how it promoted democracy, I think is an important piece of the role of corporate history in Michigan, a proud corporate history, providing this mobilization. Here's a picture of some of the different plants: Chrysler Jefferson, Midland, Kokomo, Indiana, the Dodge Main plant. Just the sheer amount of investment and effort that was necessary to bring about the end of World War II. So a little bit more about this book, if you want to go look it up on Amazon, etc. So you can see it's a number of, has all these award-winning pieces of it. There's now a second edition to it, and I'm just going to go into a little bit more depth on this book now. So in the early 1940s, Detroit was at its industrial zenith, leading the nation in economic escape from the Great Depression. Between 1940 and 1947, manufacturing employment in Detroit increased by 40%. Not easy to do. I mean, 40% is easy to do, you think, when you've got Great Depression. But how do you mobilize it so fast? That's a key component of this. The demand for manufacturing labor seemed boundless. Thousands of newcomers flooded the city, coming from places as diverse as rural Appalachia, depressed farm counties in central Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, and declining black belt regions of the Deep South. Between 1940 and 43, the number of unemployed workers in Detroit fell from 135,000 to 4,000. So this is the second Great Migration. The first comes during World War I, the deindustrialization of the South, the escape after before and after World War I in Europe. But now there's a second Great Migration, dependent on the arsenal of democracy, and it brings a whole new, especially white migration from rural areas, and a second version of the African American migration. So here's some interesting statistics about Detroit's population between 1910 and 1970. And you can see that in 1960, blacks only represented about 29% of the total population. So when we think about the Detroit riots, and I think our students don't really even have any sense of the Detroit riots. They just don't. My students who are in their 20s don't have any sense of this important history and what happened to Detroit. And there's these ideas that Detroit became a majority black city and then it rioted. It wasn't. There were 30% of the population about. But the crucial piece of this is why those riots happened. We don't have very good numbers for Hispanic populations. In Detroit, it was small. It's still small in the state overall. In the most important number that you need to know is that in 2000, there were 50,000, almost 50,000 Hispanics in the city of Detroit, especially in Southwest Detroit, building up Mexican Town, bringing all kinds of brand new businesses. It's probably one of the most happening neighborhoods in the city of Detroit. And so by 2010, 6.8% of the city is Hispanic, of any race. And in 2010, the population has declined to 713,000 from its height in 1950 to 1,850,000, almost 2 million. So here's another depiction of the change in the population. You can see the white population starts declining as early as 1950 because of the growth of the suburbs. African American population is relatively small through 1940, only about 10% of the population in 1940, maybe 15 to 20% in 1950. But it expands as a percent of the population, again, percent of the population, in part because white population is leaving. So it's not that more and more blacks are moving in. As whites leave, blacks make up, because they remain, a larger part of the percentage. The foreign-born population declines, obviously, from 30% of the population in 1900 at the height of the great, European migration to the United States. But it picks up a little bit, but to 10% as early as 1970, 1980, 1990. You can see it sort of taking off. One of the important pieces of the story of Detroit is the index of dissimilarity. And this is a hard concept for even my college students to get. But it's a really important piece of the story of Detroit. So green shows low segregation. Let's start with the index of dissimilarity. It's a ratio. It goes to 100%. If it's 0, there's no segregation at all. And if it's 100%, it's explicitly, completely, 100% segregated. So you can look at this ratio someplace in between. And northern cities tend to be more segregated than the south. Southern cities are about 60% segregated. Northern cities have been about 80% segregated, although this has changed in the last 10 years. We're seeing declining rates of segregation. One of the most disturbing aspects of the index of dissimilarity that we're looking at segregation is the role of segregation amongst children. We are now at the same rate of segregation for children that we were in the 1960s. So kids aren't going to school with other kids of color. And there's differences between white and Hispanic kids too, both being segregated from African American kids. So this looks at the geographic components, units of a city or metropolis. Again, the maximum value is 100. If all the members of each group were confined to geographic units made up exclusively on their own group, that would be a total apartheid. If individuals were randomly assigned to places in residence, the index of dissimilarity would approach the minimum value of 0. So this is for Detroit, and this you can see that the segregation of blacks from whites was about 80% in 1980, and that segregation has declined to about 70% in 2000. So those red lines going down means less segregation. But there's also segregation of Hispanics from whites. And so in 2000, the very segregated, when you have scores of 60 or more, it's still pretty substantial. But the other third piece is Asians from whites. And we have very few Asians in the state of Michigan. I think it's about 3% total. Some suburbs might be better than that. Individual suburbs are better than that. But for the state of Michigan, it's a very small population. And so there's not very much segregation for Asians. So I had told you earlier that Ford hired African Americans. Before World War II, only a handful of Detroit's major manufacturers had employed African Americans. Ford, Briggs, and Dodge, major auto manufacturers, opened their doors to a small number of African American workers beginning in the World War I era. And Detroit's Ford was the most open to this. They had actually recruited through black ministries to find solid workers who'd show up, worked every day, and be God-fearing. By 1940, nearly 12% of Ford workers were African Americans. But as late as 1942, this is already when you had geared up for that arsenal of democracy, 119 of 197 Detroit manufacturers surveyed had no black employees whatsoever. So here's a little information about black workers in the Detroit area automobile and steel plants in 1960. So this is part of the story that Segru wants to tell you. African Americans came up for jobs. They didn't always find jobs. When they did find jobs, they weren't there for very long. By the 1960s, there were already massive movements of factories outside of the city of Detroit, and because of technology, increasing productivity meant you needed fewer workers. African Americans were the last to be hired. They were the first fired. So as early as the 1950s, African Americans were losing jobs in the auto and steel manufacturing plants. So River Rouge had 40, of all the blacks employed in these areas, 40% of them worked at the Rouge. 30% worked at Steel Division, others worked at Great Lakes Steel, and General Motors, 23%. Black women gained the least from war employment. We always see Rosie the Riveter being depicted as a white woman. African American women did have access to the plants, but not as an important rate as, for example, white women had. At Packard, whites walked out on a hate strike in 1943 when 3 black women were placed as drill operators. In January 1943, 50 leading war production plants in Detroit had women workers, but only 19 hired black women. Wartime necessity eventually opened new opportunities for black women in Detroit's factories, although the majority remained employed in such capacities as janitresses and matrons. The number of black women operatives doubled in the 1940s. Nearly 1/5 of black women had factory jobs by 1950. So women were finally incorporated in the 1950s. The others worked, as Jacob Lawrence depicted, as laundresses in that great picture of the Great Migration. Let's move a little closer to home, to Lansing. So Lansing also benefited from the arsenal of democracy, but they didn't have the major plants that you would have in southeast Michigan. You need to know that southeast Michigan has about 40% of the state's population, but southeast Michigan also accounts for about 60% of the state's income. And you already had Charlie Ballard here. You probably have already seen his great presentation. I've seen it a number of times. But southeast Michigan is really the engine for the state of Michigan, especially for manufacturing, which is still really important. The other piece of it is agriculture, of course. So Lansing was an industrial city. It didn't really have the large arsenal of democracy kinds of plants that, that southeast Detroit had. But we had a number of key automobile plants, but also tool and die plants that were really crucial for that supply chain. So in 1930, we had about 78,000 population. 1940, 78,000. So it got a little bump, about 10, 12,000 by 1950 that captures that arsenal of democracy in migration. Ingham County as a whole grew a lot, by 2/3, in fact, between 1930 and 1950, after the Great Depression. And in 1950, the Lansing urbanized area was about 200,000 people. And so let's take a look at the manufacturing in Lansing. And this also is wonderful. There's a great little book that I found in the Michigan Historical Library of a man who decided he was just going to go and talk to all the great manufacturers of Lansing. And he sits down and has a talk with them, and he just sort of writes up his conversations with all of these great manufacturers that happen to be in the city of Lansing. So this is a survey that was done by Consumers Power Company. They needed to know their own sense of their own consumer base. So this was done in 1954, a little bit later than the arsenal of democracy period, but it gives you some sense of what kinds of manufacturing was here and how many people they employed. So there are lots of drop forge, you'll see a lot, stamping plants and drop forges are just when these large tool and die pieces drop onto a piece of steel and mold them. So it's just this big kaboom manufacturing process. So Fisher Body in 1950 employed 5,500 people. Does anybody know how many people work in the auto plants today? Less. About 1,200. I mean, and the newest plants, about 600. Every time you have an investment in a new plant, fewer and fewer workers, because you don't need them. Computers and robotics are doing it all. So one of the key pieces is not just the consumption of moving people out to the suburbs. It's not just racism. It's also the technology. The deindustrialization is also fueled by this amazing technology that you just don't need workers anymore. Is referred to as a structural problem these days. So Motor Wheel, they created auto wheels and water heaters, 3,000 workers. Oldsmobile, 14,000 workers. Riotown, 2,300 workers. All of these are gone. So deindustrialization really wipes out this industrial base for the city of Lansing. So let's see how that affects its population. So the white population was about 56,000 in 1920. There are a smattering of about almost 1,000 black families or individuals living in the city of Lansing in 1920. You would think that arsenal of democracy would bring in a lot of new people through migration into the city of Lansing, but actually not so much. It did increase white workers from 56,000 to 89,000 workers. Blacks, about 1,000, but it's tripled by 1950. Still a small percentage of the total population, but really, if you think about the black population tripling between 1920 and 1950, in those 30 years, gaining 1,000 people every decade, it shows to some degree the role of opportunity in the city of Lansing, in the area of Lansing. And it remains a small percentage black and a small percentage Hispanic. And we don't actually have numbers in the census for Hispanics. We used to actually ask people of Spanish origin or Spanish language in the census around 1960, and we really didn't have a category to measure until 1980, the category of Hispanic of any race, of course. And so the arsenal of democracy is important for the city of Lansing, in part because it's part of this larger story of technology and the consolidation of production and consumption. Not so much armaments, but again, these jobs get lost because of the role of technology. And this comes from census.gov, and these historical tables are really useful to think about this sort of the structural change that it would allow a regional economy to grow and how that gets affected for race. And at this point, I would show you pieces of my video, which I can't because it's old technology. So let me tell you a little bit about this video, because you're going to want to get your hands on it. It's a really cool piece of work that was done by a colleague of mine, Ken Waltzer, who's an historian at James Madison College. He's a former dean of the college, too. It was produced and underwritten by the Institute for the Integration of Arts and Humanities here on campus. And WKAR produced it, but it was 1997, so they made it in videotape. And in my classrooms at Case Hall, we can still show video. There's still VHSs. And when I tell students, you can borrow this, but they don't have a VHS machine, I said, there's still some VHS machines in the main library. Go take a look. But this is a story, includes in-depth interviews on camera with people in their homes who migrated to the city of Lansing. And what's wonderful about it is that it looks at Mexican Americans, African Americans, and Italian Americans in the early part of the 20th century. There's archival photographs and these interviews that bring Lansing's history to life. And in the last chance that I had to give this lecture, there are actually people in the audience who recognize relatives. For example, there's important chain migration for the African American community of Lansing that comes from Athens, Georgia. And there are a number, about 4 or 5 families that came together, cousins that took the train up together, just like Langston Hughes writes about it, to leave Georgia behind and find a new home in Lansing. And these happen to be some teachers' relatives in the audience. What's really important about the Mexican American story is that first Mexican Americans come to work in agriculture, and that other piece of the Michigan history story about agriculture is really crucial. The agricultural story needs to be written for Michigan. In part, it becomes also industrialized, especially the role of sugar beets. And sugar beets is important for the area around Saginaw and the Thumb area, massive migration, especially of agricultural work there, but also around Grand Rapids, working in the orchards. So Mexican-American families first come to work in the sugar beet fields, including truck farming around the city of Lansing, and then they find jobs in manufacturing as early as the 1940s. This is also true of Chicago. One of the important stories about Chicago is that Mexican Americans came to work in manufacturing in Chicago. And so Chicago is an interesting place. It's 1/3 African American, 1/3 Hispanic, and 1/3 white. Of those Hispanics, until recently, half were Puerto Rican, who of course are Americans, and 1/2 Mexican immigrants. But when Mexicans came to work in the factories in the 1940s, this was a really crucial piece of the idea of the melting pot that happened in Chicago as well as Lansing. So working in these drop forges, for example, made them a brand new industrial migration force. And then Mexican Americans moved primarily to the north side of town. This video shows exactly where these kinds of ethnic enclaves or ethnic villages developed in the city of Lansing. For the Italian Americans, they worked, again, in truck farming, but at the retail end. They're often engaged in peddling or setting up small shops, especially grocery shops in Lansing, but in surrounding areas too, and sort of created a network of people and families working in grocery work, working less so in heavy manufacturing. And then for African Americans working explicitly in the shops, but also other kinds of jobs. Barbershop work, other kinds of service work, laundry, etc. To give a sense, and this is really a valuable resource for, I think, for the Lansing School District, but for us here at Michigan State too, to think about our own backyard and our own part of the story. So let me tell you the good news about not showing this video. I've just talked to Ken Waltzer, and we were talking about how can we get this to you as a resource. So we do have master tapes of this that can be converted to DVDs. And, but of course, we're jumping the DVD technology already because kids are all streaming. So we think there could, WKAR produced it, they can cut DVDs for us. The second thing is we can just do it online and stream online, so you could have it in your classrooms. So that's in the works. That's the good news. I can't show it to you. It's a great resource. If you want to borrow it, this copy is available at the Michigan State Library. I have the call number right there, so you can go check it out. It's only 33 minutes, so that's pretty great because it's short enough to actually show in a class time. It's important for me too, to get these stories, out there. But it also could be a great piece of incentive for students to go out and do their own oral histories. I mean, this is the generation that's just been lost. They're in their 80s now. This was done in 1997. Some were older, but there's a whole new generation of young people who had worked in the area. My colleague Lisa Fine in history just did a great book on Rio Town in Lansing. That's also an important piece. I think you did a tour of Rio Town, or are going to do a tour of Rio Town. So this piece of Lansing history is important to recapture, and hopefully your students can do some of that. So I'm done, unless you have questions. Let me just say just a couple other things about deindustrialization. So the story of the Detroit riots is that this deindustrialization happened before the riots. As early as the 1950s, the riots were the culmination of all this frustration. In many social scientific studies of American cities, urban problems seem almost inevitable. The shape of the post-war city, I contend, is the result of political and economic decisions, of choices made and not made by various institutions, groups, and individuals. Industrial location politic is not solely the result of technical imperatives. It's the result of corporate policies to minimize union strength, to avoid taxes, to exploit new markets. And here we see the job loss between 1951 and 1953. 1,700 jobs lost in just the engine division at the Rouge, another 200 lost in gear and axle, total 4,000 jobs lost in 2 years. 1947 to 1977, this is the decline in manufacturing in thousands. 3,272 jobs lost in 1947. Another 3,000 lost in 1954. Another 3,000 lost in 1958. Another 3,000 lost in 1963. Yikes. Percentage of men between the ages of 15 and 29 not in the labor force. You can see that white kids can keep their jobs in the plants. 25 to 29, 2.3 kids are in the labor force, but non-white kids, not. Joblessness in Detroit and unemployment, blacks unemployed by 1950, 12%, compared to 7.5 of all workers. These statistics hold true for today, the same kind of percentages. The change in the post-industrial city completely making the center city something different. It's not a manufacturing center anymore. But what can we do about the center city? This is a picture of Wayne State's incubator Tech Town, where you have an old manufacturing building now serving as an incubator for new high-tech companies. 200 of them in there. And that's the future. Here's River Rouge repurposed. This is a picture from their website looking at the green project of River Rouge. And so these are hopeful signs about repurposing the city. Questions?
My impression, when you were talking about Henry Ford and his heirs, I mean, we know that he was greedy, anti-Semite, racist, and it's really outrageous. I mean, unless I'm reading too much into it, it's really obscene that this man actively recruited African American men, predominantly in the South, through these mediums, these preachers, to bring them north to work for a derisory wage in very dangerous conditions, and at the slightest downturn in his profit margin, he just lets these people go, and they become unemployed. And the second thing I'm seeing is that from the graphs that that were depicted on the screen,
yeah.
Whenever there's
the employment ones?
you see these islands of. When you were talking about the deindustrialization, the white population leaves, it actually decreases, but the black population increases.
The
It seems
percentage
like
of the
they become-
population increases.
Right, it seems like they become marooned there, like
Yeah.
basically a prison of sorts.
Yeah, because they don't have cars. If you don't have a job, you don't have a car. If you don't have a car, you can't get to the jobs in the suburbs. And so in political economy literature, it's called the spatial mismatch. You know, people can't get to those jobs. And then of course there's residential segregation. They're not allowed to buy houses in the suburbs because of housing discrimination. So marooned is right.
One side we've had that lately is about how you see that how they're putting these community gardens in cities.
Yeah.
It's because if you're in those settings, okay, the stores, you know, the Walmarts, the Targets are all in the suburbs. Your only place to buy food at sometimes is a 7-Eleven.
Exactly. You know, there's this term food desert.
And I will tell you, when I lived there, I always shopped in the suburbs because it was cheaper.
Yes,
When I
that's
went
right.
out to my job in the suburbs, I shopped and I went back home to Detroit.
Banks fled. There's no place to be banking. There's no chain grocery stores in the city. Just recently, in the last 10 years as I've been doing my tour, some new things have been happening. So the first kinds of places that come in are chain restaurants, like McDonald's or KFC, but at least they're investing. Banks, less so. But just recently, 2 grocery stores are moving into the city of Detroit, and one of them is Whole Foods.
Yeah.
So, you know, yeah, whole paycheck, as somebody once called it.
Yeah,
But it's in part because of the loft development that's coming up on Woodward in the Wayne State Midtown area. And there's new investment in the Symphony area, and they think that could support a store there.
Well,
So Henry Ford,
yeah.
but he's the only one that hired him. So I actually am married into a Jewish family, so of course I always knew about Henry Ford and his anti-Semitism. But he at least hired blacks, and Chrysler and GM did not. That's that's an interesting story. And thanks to Tom Segru, who went and did all those record searches to find out who was exactly employed and not employed. That's an amazing part of the
we're
twist
going
of
to
the
need
story.
to wrap
What
up.
prove that he was more greedy than he was a racist?
Maybe. Is that a question?
Well, he thought he knew the right way, right? I mean,
It still exists.
He was
the company
Henry
still
Ford.
exists. The company
the Ford
still,
way, right?
Yeah. Another question?
I just had a comment because I teach in Detroit, and I know other people who teach in what they call urban areas, and it's always, everything always goes back to money, employment, what the children are going through, their problems that they bring to the classroom. Everything kind of, to me, kind of ties back to the parents are not employed, so they have, they don't have, maybe they don't have anywhere to live, they're living in cars, they don't have food, and they ask the teachers to impact them in education, and it's going round and round.
A vicious cycle, as we like to say, yeah. Without those unskilled jobs that really supported all of those immigrants and all those immigrant families, but also the kinds of, I would not leave out, the government programs that help those white immigrant families. There's another great book called When Affirmative Action Was White by Ira Katznelson. Whites got GI Bill benefits, African Americans did not. They had supportive public schools on the suburbs. There's disinvestment in the urban schools. Those kids got to go to university that were supported by the state, not anymore. It's like, they're the government piece of that, of the Fordist structure, really important that we think they're not just losing jobs, they're losing the entire infrastructure that helped the middle class rise up.
And also the total loss of the tax base
Oh, absolutely.
that supports the schools, among other things.
Yes,
And,
as we speak.
I mean, the same kind of happened in Philadelphia, which is where I'm from. All the manufacturing plants closed down. So either people left, suburban flight, or they had to leave because there were no jobs. And then, the churches then are closing because they can't
Yeah,
maintain
the
their
population is
buildings
left.
even. So there's another social service gone.
So the question then comes for our students who live in these cities, mine included, is how do you reinvest in Michigan? How do you reinvest in Lansing? How do we reinvest in Detroit? What kinds of new things can we create? How do we create a new place for ourselves? I think it's time for, all of us to think about rededicating ourselves, including teachers, to think about repurposing this landscape that we have to new ways. And Tech Town is just one example.
Okay, this I'm going to make you the last question. Yep.
Where are we with the movie industry because that was such a positive thing. My son lives in California and he says there are so many Michigan State people out there. It's incredible. And it's like people move there for that industry because that is a booming industry. And we had that chance. Where are we with that?
The legislature cut the subsidy.
How
In
does
part
that
because
happen?
the reason is because there's debate about whether or not we should be picking industries and to subsidize them, or whether or not the market should do that themselves. There's no market for it that comes indigenously from people from California saying, yeah, let's go to Michigan and let's make movies there, or through tax breaks. And so we cut those tax breaks because there's a sense from one side of the debate that says we shouldn't be picking winners and losers. There's no subsidy of any corporations. They should stand on their own 2 feet one way or another. So it was a political decision to cut it.
It was free advertising for Michigan.
And it created new job sectors. They could actually they could actually calculate, this would be a question for Charlie, you know, the kind of return that you got on that investment. Return on investment, ROI. The number of tax dollars that went in to subsidize that, and the number of jobs that got created, and as well as spin-offs, you know, not just film people, but people who could do catering to support
Right.
that and things like that.
That ties into what I was talking about earlier, Richard Florida, who
Yeah,
writes
Creative
the
Cities.
books on creative culture, an economist who talks about
Yeah.
if you're going to create a city that people want to live in, it's got to attract creative thinkers and creative people. So,
Yeah, I get back.
yeah. So
This,
I hate to cut you off because
That's
it
okay.
looks like you've really struck a chord here. I think my microphone is on, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dr. Jeziersky.
Thanks for doing your
really,
work.
really very rich information and nice
Email me to
delivery.
find out more about Madison or any of the residential colleges here at MSU. They're the best deal in town, and they're a fantastic education.
Yeah.
It's the best
I wish
job
I
in the
could
world.
do it over. I would do that. Yeah.
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 We've got